Welcome back to Modding Monday, everyone. Farming mods can be a little bit overwhelming at times, partially because there are so many different mod sets out there to choose from. So what I want to do in today's video is take a look at which ones you should be farming the most, and by contrast, which ones you should be farming the least. So this is going to be a pretty standard list ranking type video where we're going to go through and rank all the mod sets. And a big surprise to absolutely no one, speed is going to take the cake in first place. Now, we do play a turn-based game, so just logically, it makes a ton of sense that taking more turns would be advantageous, and it is just true. Whether you are a support character that wants to immediately go out to increase cooldowns, or call on someone to assist, or you're a tank character that wants to immediately get to taunt up, or you're an attacker that immediately wants to get damage out. All of these things end up being important. Now, in addition to that, you might be thinking, well, speed is important, but I have a lot of teams that are going to be also generating turn meter and can kind of get around that. And while that is partially true, there are just a lot of mechanics right now that stop turn meter game. Hux is actually a pretty good example of that with his boundless ambition. That means whenever he has advantage, the enemy team can't gain turn meter. In addition to that, there are a lot of common debuffs like Daze, Shock, as well as Doubt that will stop turn meter hard cold. Or you just have an entire character that completely turns off turn meter for both sides, unless your name is Marin. So overall, speed really hasn't gone down in value. It's really gone up overall, even with other mechanics competing against it. Now, next up is going to be offense coming in second place. Probably not a very big surprise either. And while this is not meant to be a critique on crit damage, we'll talk more about crit damage when it comes up, but we will be referencing it a few times within this. So in the same vein that we play a turn-based game and we want to take turns, you also win those battles by dealing damage enough to the opponents that they are no longer able to stay on the battlefield. This is why offense is coming in above all the other stats. And offense, it can be used in several different ways. It can be used on a character that has crit damage to get those numbers even higher, but it can also be used completely on its own with characters who deal true damage. If we look at Maul, you can see here that he says deal true damage to target enemy and inflict buff immunity for 2 turns. This is a move that he gets to repeat 5 times sometimes, so it's a big source of damage for the Lord Vader team. This type of thing has become more and more common, particularly at the very end game, where you start running into teams that are just completely immune to critical hits, and offense just doesn't really care, or I should say, true damage just doesn't really care. When we look at Rey and her ultimate Heir to the Jedi, it is going to be dealing true damage to the entire enemy team. When we look at her sudden whirlwind, this actually isn't dependent on offense or crit damage at all, so it's kind of immune to both. Beskar Mando is going to have a very similar effect with his whistling birds. These will also all be dealing true damage, completely ignoring the opponent's armor. So once again, just not really caring about crits, but offense can be boosting all these. We even have like tanks that occasionally benefit from offense like Balin, or even supports like Admiral Radis, who I don't know if this was CG's intention when they made the character, but his whole thing lives or dies off of whether or not Hope can annihilate DTMG or Iden, pretty much in one fell swoop, because once they shake off the locked healing immunity and protection disruption, they become very killable again. So offense again, just kind of taking the cake. It's in the nature of the game. You want to be able to defeat your enemies as soon as possible or at all, and you don't have a lot of the drawbacks that say crit damage does, where you just get locked out of characters who have crit immunity, whether it be from mastery, from the buff, or for some other weird mechanic like SLKR's advantage. So overall, second place. Next up is going to be health, and I won't lie, I considered very heavily putting defense above this, but ultimately it's going to have to go away, and it's because of the reason we just talked about with offense. There is an overwhelming amount of true damage or just mechanics that bypass defense entirely. And while defense can do a lot of really cool things, and there's a reason it's going to be in fourth place, health is going to beat it out specifically because of that. We have characters that just want to survive, particularly against enemies that are dealing true damage, like Sith Eternal. And then we also, this is actually a really common theme that I think is becoming even more common. Health is being used in secondary ways that aren't just about surviving. For example, Darth Malgus, the damage of Dark Deception, this big hit right here, is based off of 40% of his max health. That's not uncommon either nowadays. I believe Jabba and Leia also deal specific hits based off of their max health. Queen Amidala doesn't deal damage per se off of her max health, but she does take her max health and then convert it into protection up, which is based off of her max health, and then that is turned into courage. That also kind of applies to the JMK team, just without the courage aspect of it. General Grievous himself is actually going to deal all of his attacks based off his max health, not just one or two like Malgus or Leia that we talked about earlier. And then it's also really not uncommon to have characters who are going to heal or revive their team based off of their own max health, like Daka. In addition to what we were talking about with Padme, the protection up being based off of her health, that's not a Padme thing. That is a protection up thing. So anytime you have a character that has protection up or even bonus protection, which by the way is different for a very fun reason, those are always based off of max health. So even if you occasionally run across the types of characters that have max health damage, if one of your ways of fighting against that is protection up or bonus protection, you are actually farther out ahead by using health sets. Now, protection sets don't exist, so that argument didn't really need to be made, but at the same time, it is worth stating. This is actually one of the reasons why the Traya Omicron is so good right now, specifically against the Inquisitors, because even with Deathmark, the amount of debuffs that they're putting out on the Traya team, based off of their max health, they're able to survive more from those debuffs than the Deathmark is dealing in damage. Now, next up is going to be defense, and I love defense sets. They actually might be my favorite sets because I feel like they're undervalued by the majority of players. And in reality, because of the massive bonus they give over health, they're actually going to be mitigating more damage on average than health sets. The reason why I wanted to put health sets above them, or I would say I had to put health sets above them, is because health is just going to be universal. You don't have to worry about all those instances of either true damage or where they can reduce your defense to essentially nothing. But in those opportunities that they can't do one of those 2 or 3 things, then defense, again, is going to actually mitigate damage. And while not nearly as common as health, Ahsoka does turn her defense into offense for whatever it's worth. So that is a nice bonus on top of things. Overall, just having a ton of defense on a character that already has a high defense stat so that it can multiply even higher is going to benefit characters a lot more in the long run. I could say that it also helps kind of mitigate max health damage, but that's not really true at all. The only thing that you're really mitigating is the fact that you don't have more health from health, but again, that's really about your health and protection ratio more than something defense itself is actually doing. Malik's another great example of defense. Even with his defense being lowered through ferocity, at least the small amount under a Malgus lead via Darth Revan special, defense still ultimately comes out on top. And I actually like defense for attackers who don't necessarily need potency or tenacity or crit chance, because it just makes them a little bit tankier. And Grand Inquisitor is a great example of this, particularly under Reva, who is going to always have them crit whenever an enemy actually can be crit. So even though he's kind of an attacker, he doesn't need the bonus from crit chance. He can actually just focus on surviving because the enemy loves to attack him with the defense set. And then DTMG is another great example of characters who really do well at not dying when they have extra defense. Now, next up are going to be tenacity and potency. And the reason why they're ranked lower down than the other 4 stats above them is because they've become devalued quite a bit by tenacity down and tenacity up. For those of you who are not aware, but whenever you have a character that has tenacity down, like say on Chewbacca's basic, tenacity down cannot be resisted. That's not a Chewbacca thing, that is a tenacity down thing. And tenacity down isn't like negative 50% tenacity, it's negative 99,000, meaning you are never going to influence that with a tenacity or a potency check. In addition to that, tenacity up is going to do the exact opposite effect, where it's going to increase your tenacity by, again, 99,000. So the only thing that can really devalue tenacity down is tenacity up, and vice versa. So that is going to come into play here because, I can mod my Chewbacca for as much tenacity as I want. The second Jedi Master Luke does his little hand wave and puts tenacity down on him. Almost every debuff after that is sticking. There's actually a 50% chance that he can still resist it, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Now, I am going to put tenacity over potency for two reasons. And the first one being the tenacity ratios for the actual mod sets is just better. You get 20% for a level 15, whereas you get 15 for a potency. And you might think that that would scale universally. It doesn't. When we look at a mod that has both tenacity and potency as a secondary on it, like say this one with the Saw's Ventress right here, and we go and we look in here, it will say that your slice range for tenacity and potency is 1.5 to 3% on both. Meaning, if you have a character, like say B2, who wants both of them, you are better off trying to get potency from the secondary, where all things are equal, and tenacity from say a set or a primary, where it is enhanced and there is an advantage. So just something small to note. The other reason why I'm going to give tenacity the advantage over potency is because tenacity can actually 100% block debuffs, assuming there is no tenacity down in play. How this works is on my Chewbacca here, let's say his tenacity is at 165%, and I'm going up against a General Skywalker whose potency is 60%. I'm over 100% tenacious than he has potency. I will resist daze every single time, assuming there isn't an outside factor that is increasing his potency or reducing my tenacity. The exact same thing actually can't be said about potency. I can put as much potency as I want on my Afra. I can get her up to, what is she at right now? I can get up to 138%. I can apply her leadership Omicron so that she gets another 50%. I can put a Datacron on her to give her another 150 or something stupid percent and get her all the way up to 400% potency. If I go up against an enemy that say has 0% tenacity and doesn't look like they can really resist, for whatever reason, the developers thought that it was important. Ever since the game has started, there is a 15% base resist chance, meaning that if your debuff that you're going to put out, or turn meter reduction or whatever, if it is not irresistible, there is always a small chance that the enemy will resist it. And that really just kind of annoys me. You know, you do all these work with all these sets and all these secondaries and all these primaries to potency mod a character, right? And it's still not going to happen 100% of the time. Now, it's still obviously a valuable set. We have it ranked above the bottom two, but ultimately I would say tenacity is more important than it, because you can, again, accomplish goals like making sure that Chewbacca cannot be dazed by General Skywalker. You can make sure that Chrysanthemum cannot get buff immunity from Lord Vader. You can make sure that Imperial Super Commando doesn't also get dazed by gas. But you guys kind of get the picture. One of the other things that I like about tenacity is that even if you can't get the 100% to necessarily box something out, little bits here and there can be really nice when you have stat sharing characters. Mon Mothma shares her tenacity. CLS will also share his tenacity if you have Nubaka on the team. So there are some kind of other ways that it can be leveraged. Potency, I'm not honestly sure if we need to talk about potency. We kind of already went over it. It's obviously nice for landing debuffs. It can't do it 100% of the time, statistically speaking, but sometimes those are a really big deal. Now, in last place, or I guess I should say second to last place, is going to be crit chance. And this is really, it's not super recent, but it is a more recent development where crit chance has really just been devalued a lot. And one of the remarks that I'll make about it too, really not in its favor, is the fact that the value is just stupid low, like 8% for crit chance. If there was a dev post that came out right now that was like, oh, we're upping crit chance to 16%, I'd be like, awesome, that would be fantastic. Like, make it do something more. So it is small, but the other issue that crit chance has is we just keep making or printing these teams that you just can't crit for whatever reason. Again, either they have crit immunity, or they have some weird mechanic where advantage stops it or protection up stops it, or they get stacking critical avoidance when you don't target a certain character. So you can, again, mod as much crit chance as you want, but as soon as you start running into these mechanical thing, it just completely stops for the most part. Now, it is nice in some ways where you have characters like the Mandalorian or General Skywalker, where the critting will actually have a secondary effect, like Mandalorian is actually going to be gaining turn meter, and I actually don't mod General Skywalker for crit chance. I guess you could against Sith Empire, but if you were to do that and guarantee those crits, then he would also be increasing their cooldowns. And I'm showing Darkseid right here just to kind of mention how silly some of the modding has been in regards to crit chance. As I said earlier, there's things like Advantage that have 200% critical chance, but then they just put things into people's kits that are like, oh yeah, when your enemy, I think it's in this one, when your enemy has less than 100% health, they have negative 200% critical avoidance. Like, why are we, why are we mining for crit chance when this is running around? And I would like to say that this is an exception, but again, it's not. We just get to some numbers that are stupid, crazy high. Like you look at Shin's kit, for example, where she's actually going to give all mercenary allies 5% critical chance and critical damage. They can have like 50 stacks of Soldiers of Fortune. So you just get to these astronomical numbers that the modding, while not harmful, ends up just becoming a drop in the bucket, again, with how low the numbers are. And on the other side of things, we run into the same problem, but in the opposite way, where characters like Ben Solo don't really have a way to increase their crit chance in the battle, and their modding, or their stats, really just don't help them out. So Ben Solo is a special damage dealer, meaning he uses special offense critical chance. It's at 53%. If I increase that by 8, or heck, if I increase that by 24% by using 3 crit chance sets, he's like barely scratching 75%. And at that point, I'm going to run into a character who has 30% critical avoidance, and the whole thing is ultimately just not going to matter. I'm better off leveraging his true damage and just going for not only an offense set without a crit chance secondary, but also an offense primary. So again, crit chance has just kind of gone the way of the dodo. There are a few exceptions. We talked about Mando. Sith Trooper is actually another really good example, or at least he was before DSR came out, because while the First Order team does hand advantage out like candy, he also assists like candy all the time. So you couldn't always rely on him having advantage. That actually might not be a thing anymore. And last and least is going to be crit damage. The problem here is while crit damage as a stat itself is really good, the values that you actually get from the set, just the majority of the time, are not enough to actually compete with offense. Again, not only do you run into scenarios where you actually can't crit the opponent, to which case they become totally useless, but if you get your 36 or your 42% crit damage from a primary, then you really don't need a whole lot more in most circumstances. Now, there are exceptions to this. One of the best exceptions to this is going to be Jedi Anakin, who not only is going to get a giant offense boost, but that offense boost is not at all dependent on his own stats. Because the issue that we run into with a lot of these other characters is, if we were to put an offense set on them, and their offense were to scale with another stat like Marauder, it's actually kind of a fun example because I actually have a crit damage set on him. He's going to increase his offense. So if we had a higher base offense, he would actually benefit just as well from an offense set. But Jedi Anakin would actually not benefit from an offense set because the amount of offense that's coming over from Qui-Gon Jinn already makes his base massively high. We want the multiplier to be as well massively high through a crit damage set as well through a crit damage primary. So it has become pretty niche, but basically anytime you see a character who is getting a offensive boost that is also not coming from themselves, and they are attacker, and the enemy can actually be crit, then it probably is advantageous to use a crit damage set. But that's quite a few hoops to jump through, especially when you consider how easy and universal some of these beginning stats were. So that is going to be today's video on sets. Let me know what you guys think, and as always, stay awesome.